All right. So, good morning, everyone, or rather, good noon. All right. Relationships carry their own baggages. So, to love is not a light matter. To love, in order to love, one must make promises and make compromises, communicate boundaries, and even take on responsibilities. And when these relationships are between mortals and beings that are deeply tied to nature, the humans become not only concerned for themselves, but also for their environment, which is exactly what I'd like to talk about in my presentation today. Organic encounters, mortal encanto, courtship as avenues for responsibility towards the non-human world. So, according to Francisco Demetrio, engkantos are usually presented as mischievous lovers who use trickery, their beauty, or generosity in order to allure mortals into their grasp for casual moments of romance or sex. However, in legends from Visayas and neighboring islands, encantos are more presented as formal beings who engage in courtship traditions with humans. And these courtship traditions are they dramatize ethical relations between humans and the non-human world. So, in order for us to understand how these dynamics come into play, we must turn towards an ecological lens, specifically Gary Snyder's assessment of language, culture, and human creativity in regards to nature. He asserts that human creativity and culture and language, these are not entirely our own. They are not independent human creations, but they are inspired by the non-human world that surrounds us. And similarly, these Encanto legends present the non-human with customs that are strange but not impossible to understand. It actually makes them more like fellow neighbors of human society. And so, because these customs heavily revolve around courtship, we must also have a background on Filipino courtship traditions. In Filipino culture, courtship is public for a personal affair, and it even involves not just the couple, but even their respective families and even the community to assure that the courtship is or the marriage negotiations are going well. So with these theoretical concepts, we will be able to answer the question of how do courtship traditions with encantos transform non-human dwellings into morally demanding sites that call for responsibility. We break this down into three subpoints. The first is the manner in which these dwellings transform once humans become aware that encantos live among them. The second is how courtship traditions allow humans to be involved in environmental affairs. And finally, what kinds of responsibility are humans called for towards the end of these stories? So, we will be exploring these concepts in these three legends. The first is Fairy and the Fisherman from Palawan. The second is Legend of Akas in Northern Samar. And finally, I was courted by a tamawo in Carabao Island of Romblon. So, beginning with the fairy and the fisherman, through strange encounters of people appearing and disappearing on forest paths, the non-human transforms from vacant to inhabited shared spaces with fairies. And even when the fisherman encounters a woman who claims to be a princess of a kingdom named Belaya, and then cross-referencing that with his uncle's understanding of Belaya, he finds a contradiction with his surroundings. That Belaya is both a kingdom and an island not inhabited by human beings, untouched. But we find out that it is actually shared with beings beyond humans. In Legend of Akas, through the man's act of approaching the balete tree in the thick forest to hunt, he witnesses what it truly means for a balete tree to be a fairy's home. It is, in fact, in the shape of a literal house, a palace like home. It is no longer as humans have ascribed meanings to it, which is as a geographical landmark to navigate around the forest or a site for resources. And finally, the events that occur in I Was Courted by a Tamawo is very similar to Maxfield and Millington's note that Tamawo homes look like human homes to its victims. Similarly, by following the call of two familiar women, he was allured into the home of a young Tamawo suitor, nakapumada with santan gel. And he demonstrates the assumption that every human-shaped home shelters its own kind, when in fact, it does not. So in all these three scenarios, the non-human asserts their meanings of space through strange and uncanny encounters. And as we move on to the presence of courtship traditions, we begin to realize that the humans are not only just aware, they also become involved in the affairs of the engkantos. For example, in two of the legends that focus on fairies, with the courtship traditions, the fairies establish and respect boundaries. For example, in Fairy and the fisherman would be awoken for several late nights, and he would be awoken to music played by women outside his door. Upon receiving the call of a woman, he opens the door where the fairy princess is there, confessing her love to him. This scenario is very similar to the Harana tradition, but the Harana tradition is supposed to be initiated by the man, by the boy, and it's supposed to be a public occasion, gathering the attention of the neighborhood. But here, the Harana is gender bent. It is private as well because only the man can hear the music. And what both of these have in common, however, is the fact that they follow the spatial etiquette of the Harana practice. That it depends on the woman's response where the man is staying while he is playing the music for her. If he receives a favorable response, he may be allowed to enter into the woman's home. And in the same way, by what the fairies are doing, that they're playing the music patiently for several nights, they are respecting the fisherman, the human's boundaries. However, these boundaries are then reciprocated in Legend of Akas, because here, the protagonist Akas is willing to marry this fairy woman, but he is also concerned for his mother who lives alone. So, he and the fairy come towards a compromise. He will follow all the fairy's marriage traditions as long as they happen inside his house. The fairy also puts in a condition. During the wedding ceremony, all the lights must be turned off. And so in doing so, both the fairy and the man become involved in each other's affairs. And it is very reflective of how Filipino marriage works. Because it doesn't just unite the couple, it also unites their respective families. The families will be concerned of each other's problems, of each other's affairs. But what is unique here is that the fairy and the man's negotiation is not only connecting themselves, it is also uniting the world of the mortals and the world of the engkantos. And the man here actually learns that the fairies are sensitive to changes in their environment. And finally, in I Was Courted by a Tamawo, the home that is presented here is very much similar to the pamalayi or the pamamanhikan practice in Filipino courtship. The pamalayi is supposed to be the first formal meeting between the suitor and the maiden, often arranged by the parents of the couple. And it has a very long process, right? And in this tradition, the suitor would be screened by the parents of the maiden. It would also be the suitor's family that visits the maiden's home. But here in the pamalayi of the legend, it is inverted. It is the women instead who enter the young male tamawo's home. And But there is still similarities, like how there is food present during the legend, sweet rice, that actually if the man ate that rice, he would become a tamawo. He would not be able to return to the human realm. And there's also the presence of dignified persons, which is very similar to the parents that are present during the marriage negotiations of the Pamalay. So by creating this setting that almost looks like what humans are doing in human society, the man's accidental encounter is reframed into an intrusion to a momentous occasion. And in this way, the tamawo and what they're doing asserts some sort of, it's calling for respect to not just barge in uninvited in any non-human space. So, how humans realize the responsibility is often through a lifetime commitment, because as Demetrio makes an insight that humans who encounter engkantos often return as wiser beings who answer a personal calling. Here, the calling is through an act of marriage. The two people who accept the fairies' confession often have to go through a marriage where they have to leave the human world behind. But for the man who saw the tamawo, the man who saw the tamawo, he was able to escape by not eating anything during his stay. He would return to the human world more anxious and more careful, a wiser witness. So these human qualities in Encanto affairs establishes boundaries for seemingly empty, distant spaces. And they also show that nature also compromises, because nature here is presented fully accommodating of humans' needs. They are also concerned of their own sustainability. And this is important for the third point, which is that humans are held accountable to their agreements and consequences. It is very important in all three legends, especially I Was Courted by a Tamawo, which was set during a period of war. We often relate the idea of war to human crises, but these stories also show that the non-human through the encantos share the pains, the loves, and desires of the human society. So these legends then refuse that the non-human world is incomprehensible or a distant entity, inviting humans to a world that lives, loves, and hurts like any other person would. These legends show the world as more like a quiet lover, patiently beckoning us to answer their call. And then it calls for comparative studies on legends, not even just within the Philippines, but maybe even towards or around Southeast Asia, that show how intimacy or communal traditions beyond love are used as literary devices to establish a relationship with nature. And with that being said, here are my sources, and thank you very much for listening to my presentation.